This mini lecture will look at ways to cite your sources that you use both in your outline and during your speech. Now, just as you need to cite your sources in a paper, you also need to cite your sources in a speech. Plagiarism is a violation in written and spoken work. You must cite your sources in your outline and during your speech, but each is done a little differently, so let's find out how. Let's start with the outline. Just as you use parenthetical citation when you write a paper, you can also use parenthetical citation in your outline. You could do this. So what is parenthetical citation? This is where you put the source in parentheses after using information from the source. And for those of you who have had to write a research paper, you should be familiar with this. Or if you have taken English 101 or are currently taking that, that should be familiar or will soon be familiar to you. Now, you may use MLA or APA format. That does not necessarily matter to me. However, I'm going to present you with an alternate way of doing this. First, I highly recommend that you utilize the variety of resources available at the Hack Library. You can find a link to the Hack Library Guide for citing sources in D2L under Week 5 module, then look at the sub-module Citing Your Sources. That can give you some information on how to cite sources using MLA. But this other way that I want to talk about is how to cite a source in your outline that is linked or the same as how you will say the source in your speech. This is the strategy that I would recommend that you use when you are citing your source in your outline. Okay, so when you write using a parenthetical citation makes sense. Your audience is a reader. If they're not sure, they can reference back to something. They can look in your list of works cited or your bibliography. When you are listening to a message, we don't have the benefit of hitting stop and rewind and going and listening to information again. So we need to make sure that we get it right the first time. For this, you're going to orally cite your sources. Now, it would sound weird to say a parenthetical citation. So you want to say your source during your speech a little differently than you would when writing a paper. Generally speaking, you want to give your audience enough information about your source so that they can evaluate the credibility of your information. And if they wanted to go track the source down, they could also do that. So what do you include? Well, if there's an author, you want to include the name of the author. You also would want to include the type of source. Was it a magazine, a website, a blog? Did you find this in an encyclopedia? What was the title or description of the source? If the article has a title, you would want to include that. And you would also want to include the date. As a general rule, again, enough information to allow your audience to evaluate the credibility of your source. So let's take a look at a few examples. Let's imagine that I, again, am doing a speech about tomatoes, and I use an article from the New York Times by Martin Dell, and it's called How to Grow Monster Tomatoes. During my speech, I could say something like this. According to a May 15, 2014 article in the New York Times by Martin Dell titled How to Grow Monster Tomatoes. And then I would go on to say what the article said. Other examples are, as reported on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website, cdc.gov, in an article, Preventing Seasonal Flu with Vaccination. If I was a listener and I heard that source and I heard Centers for Disease Control and I heard the title of the article, that would allow me to quickly determine that, you know what, okay, I think I'm going to judge this information to be credible. And you can read through other examples. One thing that I should note is that providing the author's name is beneficial, but if there is any other additional information that you could find out about an author, that would be even better. So going back to our first example with the article How to Grow Monster Tomatoes. That's fine that I said who the author was, Martin Dell, but it doesn't tell me anything about who Martin Dell is. So perhaps I just do a quick Google search, typing in Martin Dell, and I find that Martin Dell is a columnist for the New York Times who has degrees in agriculture and has been writing for the newspaper for 20 plus years. I could say a little bit of that information because that would help to increase Martindale's credibility. So all those things you want to consider. Now, when you are thinking about how you're going to cite your source, how you are going to say your source during your speech, my suggestion is that you write your source in your preparation and your delivery outline the way that you want to say it during your speech. If you write your source this way in your preparation outline, you can then practice saying it that way so that it becomes more familiar to you. And you would also want to include that in your delivery outline because that might be information that you won't quite remember word for word, and not that you need to remember it word for word. You want to make sure you include as much information as possible, but you could put that directly into your delivery outline. So rather than using a parenthetical citation as you would when you write, you would want to write your source into your preparation outline the way you want to say it during your speech. So let's take a look at works cited or a bibliography. At the end of your preparation outline, you will include a list of works cited or bibliography. I don't care which one you call it. Again, you can use MLA or APA style. The way that this is done would be the exact same way that you would do it when you were writing a research paper for another class. The difference being, remember that you need to include some annotated bibliographies, and those can be included right in the works cited. Now, the Hack Library again has a how to cite sources link on their website, and I would highly recommend that you use that. If you ever have any questions about sources, how to use sources, how to cite sources, you can certainly post those questions to the discussion board, or I would gladly answer any questions you have via email.